In 1887, a leather-bound journal was sealed near Helena, Montana. Inside is a confession few were ever meant to read. Written by Mother Superior Catherine, it describes a woman married to 4 men, bound by blood and secrecy. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. Ruth Callahan's hands trembled as she held the oil lamp above her sleeping husband's face. The October wind rattled the cabin windows, but she barely heard it over the pounding of her own heart. 2 weeks had passed since she'd given birth to her 4th child. 2 weeks since her body had been strong enough to move without pain. 2 weeks since she'd been able to think clearly about what she'd seen. Daniel lay on his back, one arm thrown across the pillow, the other resting on his chest. In the flickering lamplight, Ruth studied that hand with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She'd been studying it for days now, whenever he slept, whenever he worked in the yard, whenever he reached across the dinner table. The crescent-shaped scar on the back of his left hand, just below the knuckles, caught the light like an accusation. She'd seen that scar before. Not on Daniel. On Samuel. Ruth lowered the lamp, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind kept circling back to the same impossible conclusion, then retreating from it like a hand from a hot stove. Samuel had died 3 years ago in the barn fire. She'd attended his funeral. She'd watched them lower the pine coffin into the frozen ground outside the settlement cemetery. She'd stood there with Thomas beside her, Thomas who would become her 3rd husband within the month, Thomas who would father her 3rd child before drowning in Blackfoot River. Except now Daniel lay in her bed, and that scar refused to disappear. Ruth set the lamp on the bedside table and moved to the window. Outside, the Montana Territory stretched away into darkness, mile after mile of wilderness that had swallowed her whole life. 8 years ago, she'd been Ruth Whitfield, daughter of a land speculator, owner of property holdings that made men's eyes gleam with calculation. 8 years ago, she'd met Jacob Callahan at a territorial land office in Garnet, a mining settlement clinging to the mountain slopes like lichen to stone. Jacob had been handsome in a weathered way, his smile easy despite the hardness the territory carved into men's faces. He'd asked her about her father's holdings, with what seemed like genuine interest rather than greed. When he'd proposed marriage 3 weeks later, she'd accepted partly out of loneliness and partly out of practical necessity. A woman alone in Montana Territory in 1879 needed a husband the way she needed water. The marriage had lasted 3 months before the mine collapse. They'd brought Jacob's body up in pieces, or so they'd told her. The coffin they buried had been sealed. Ruth had been 4 months pregnant and too broken by grief to question anything. Samuel had arrived in February, appearing at her cabin door like an answer to prayers she hadn't known how to voice. He'd claimed to be Jacob's younger brother, riding up from Colorado, where the family had scattered like seeds in wind. He'd explained about the tradition, about how the Callahan brothers took care of their own, about how he'd come to honor his brother's memory by protecting Jacob's widow and unborn child. Ruth turned from the window and looked at Daniel again. In sleep, his face held the same angles she remembered from Jacob, the same bone structure she'd traced on Samuel's face in the dark, the same features she'd learned to recognize on Thomas. The Callahan brothers, they'd said, all cut from the same cloth, all bearing that strong family resemblance that made people remark on it at church socials and town gatherings. but families didn't share scars. She moved to the trunk at the foot of the bed, lifting the lid with care to keep it from creaking. Inside lay the accumulated debris of 8 years of marriage and widowhood. Her wedding dress, now too small after 4 pregnancies, letters from relatives who'd stopped writing years ago, photographs that seemed to belong to someone else's life. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, she found what she was looking for. The daguerreotype of Samuel had been taken in 1881, a year after their marriage. He stood rigid in his Sunday clothes, one hand resting on a decorative column that the photographer in Helena kept in his studio. Ruth brought the image close to the lamplight, her eyes seeking that left hand, searching the grainy silver surface for proof of what her memory insisted it had seen. The scar was there. Faint but visible, that same crescent shape on the back of his left hand. Ruth's fingers went numb. The daguerreotype slipped from her grasp and clattered against the trunk's wooden bottom. Daniel stirred, but didn't wake. Outside, an owl called from the pine trees, its voice cutting through the night like a blade through cloth. She reached back into the trunk, digging deeper, pulling out another photograph. This one showed Thomas, taken just months before his supposed death. He'd been uncomfortable in front of the camera, she remembered, kept trying to leave until she'd insisted they needed a family portrait. In the image, he stood behind her chair while she held their daughter. His hands rested on her shoulders, both hands visible, both ordinary. No scars. But there was something else, something she hadn't noticed at the time. The way his left hand gripped her shoulder, the fingers curled slightly inward as if hiding something from the camera's eye. The way the thumb extended just a bit too far, as if compensating for an injury the hand wanted to conceal. Ruth sat back on her heels, the photographs scattered around her like evidence at a crime scene. Her mind raced through 8 years of memories, examining them now with the cold precision of an investigator rather than the softness of a wife. How many times had Samuel touched his collar in that nervous way, the exact same gesture Jacob had used when he was thinking? How many times had Thomas used phrases that only Samuel should have known, intimate words spoken in darkness that should have died with him? How many times had Daniel demonstrated knowledge of where things were kept, habits that belonged to dead men, preferences that should have been buried in 3 separate graves? The baby cried from the other room, a thin wail that meant feeding time. Ruth's breasts ached in response, her body following the rhythms of motherhood, even as her mind followed darker paths. She gathered the photographs and returned them to the trunk, covering them again with layers of fabric and memory. When she entered the bedroom she shared with her infant son, she found Daniel already there, lifting the baby from his cradle with practiced ease. He looked up at her and smiled, that same warm smile she'd loved on Jacob's face, trusted on Samuel's face, relied upon on Thomas's face. "He's hungry," Daniel said, bringing the child to her. "You should rest more, Ruth. You're still recovering." She took her son and settled into the rocking chair, guiding him to her breast. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching them with what appeared to be tenderness. In the lamplight, his face could have been any of the faces she'd loved and buried. His left hand rested against the doorframe. The crescent scar caught the light. "Daniel," she said quietly, "tell me about your brothers. Tell me about Jacob and Samuel and Thomas. I want to know what they were like as boys, before I knew them." Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. Then the smile returned, easy and familiar. "Tomorrow," he said. "You need your rest tonight. We can talk about the family tomorrow." He left her alone with the baby, his footsteps creaking across the floorboards toward the room where he'd left his boots and coat. Ruth listened to those sounds, cataloging them against a lifetime of listening to men's footsteps in this house. The gait was wrong, too measured, too careful, like a man walking across ice he wasn't sure would hold his weight. The baby nursed, oblivious to his mother's racing thoughts. Outside, the October wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming snow. Ruth stared at the wall, where photographs of 4 different men hung in neat frames. 4 husbands. 4 fathers to her 4 children, 4 brothers, who'd each stepped forward to protect and provide, to honor the family name, to preserve the Callahan legacy. 4 men with the same smile, the same build, the same way of standing with weight shifted to the right leg. 4 men and 1 scar that refused to stay buried. Ruth closed her eyes and rocked her son, feeling the weight of 8 years pressing down on her chest like stones on a grave. Somewhere in the darkness of her memory, Jacob's voice whispered promises he'd never had time to keep. Or perhaps those promises had been Samuel's voice, or Thomas's, or Daniel's. Perhaps they'd all been the same voice, speaking through different masks. The lamp burned low, casting shadows that moved like ghosts across the cabin walls. In those shadows, Ruth Callahan began to see the shape of something monstrous, something that had been living in her house for 8 years, sleeping in her bed, fathering her children, stealing her life piece by piece while wearing the face of love. And that crescent-shaped scar, that small imperfection in the deception, glowed in her mind like a brand, marking the truth she could no longer deny. Late summer in 1879 arrived in Montana territory like a promise that couldn't be kept. Ruth Whitfield stood outside the land office in Garnet, watching miners trudge past with faces carved from disappointment and determination. 6 months had passed since her father's death. 6 months of managing property holdings she barely understood while men circled like wolves around wounded prey. The territory had no patience for women alone. Every conversation became a negotiation, every business dealing an exercise in being dismissed or patronized. Her father's partners wanted to buy her out at fractions of true value. Neighboring landholders suggested she'd be better off returning east. The territorial judge had looked at her across his desk and said, with something approaching kindness, that a woman couldn't hold land properly without a man's name attached to it. Jacob Callahan changed that calculation. She'd noticed him first because he didn't stare. Most men in Garnet looked at her like she was a problem requiring solution, but Jacob had simply nodded when they'd passed in the land office hallway. He'd been filing claims for a mining operation, his paperwork spread across the clerk's desk, with the careful organization of someone who understood bureaucracy. "Miss Whitfield," he'd said, when they'd been introduced by the clerk. "I knew your father. He was fair in his dealings." That simple acknowledgement, that recognition of her father as a person rather than an obstacle to inheritance, had cracked something open in Ruth's chest. They'd talked for 20 minutes about mineral rights and survey boundaries, and Jacob had spoken to her like she had a mind worth engaging. The courtship, if it could be called that, lasted 3 weeks. Jacob appeared at church socials, always respectful, never presumptuous. He brought her documents that needed her signature, explaining each clause with patience. He asked about her plans for the property, listening to her answers as if they mattered. When he proposed, they were standing on the ridge overlooking her father's primary land holding. The valley stretched below them, rich with timber and possibility. "I won't lie to you," Jacob had said. "I need security, and you need protection. But I think we could build something real here, something that matters. Ruth had accepted because she was practical, because she was tired, because the alternative was losing everything her father had worked for. But she'd also accepted because Jacob's eyes held something genuine, a steadiness that felt like solid ground after months of drowning. The wedding took place in September, a simple ceremony at the Methodist church with the mine foreman and his wife as witnesses. Jacob's family couldn't attend, he'd explained. They were scattered across Colorado and Wyoming, chasing opportunities the way families did in the territories. It didn't matter. Ruth had no family left either. Their marriage settled into rhythms that felt almost normal. Jacob worked the mining claims while Ruth managed the land holdings, and in the evenings they'd sit by the fire planning expansions and improvements. He was gentle with her, patient in ways that made her think perhaps affection could grow from practical arrangements. He told her stories about growing up in a large family, about brothers who'd gone their separate ways seeking fortune. "The Callahans scatter like dandelion seeds," he'd said once, smiling. "But we always know where to find each other when it matters." 2 months into their marriage, Ruth realized she was pregnant. Jacob's reaction had been pure joy, unguarded and real. He'd lifted her off her feet, spinning her in the small cabin, making plans for cribs and cradles and the family they'd build together. 3 weeks later, the mine collapsed. They'd brought the news at dawn, the foreman's face gray with shock. There'd been a structural failure in the main shaft, he'd said. 3 men trapped. By the time they'd dug through, there was nothing left to save. The sealed coffin had seemed wrong even then, but Ruth had been too shattered to question it. Grief had its own logic, its own ways of making the impossible seem necessary. She'd stood at the graveside with her hand on her swelling belly, listening to the preacher talk about God's mysterious ways, about how the Lord called his servants home according to his own schedule. The settlement women had brought food and sympathy, their faces reflecting the same story they all knew. The territory was hard on men, harder on women, hardest on those who tried to build something permanent in a place that resisted permanence. Ruth had returned to the cabin alone, to the bed she'd shared with Jacob, to the plans they'd made that would never happen. Outside, winter began its approach across the Montana mountains, and inside, Ruth Whitfield Callahan learned what it meant to be a widow before she'd fully learned how to be a wife. She had no way of knowing that Jacob's death was the first move in a game she didn't know she was playing. Samuel Callahan arrived on a February morning when the snow lay 3 feet deep and the world had narrowed to the space between Ruth's cabin and the woodpile. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, hooves crunching through frozen crust in a rhythm that didn't match the usual supply wagons. Ruth pulled back the curtain, her 6-month-old son against her shoulder. Through the frost-edged window, she watched a man dismount, tall and lean in a sheepskin coat. Even from a distance, even through falling snow, something about his build made her chest tighten with impossible hope. Then he turned toward the cabin, and that hope died as quickly as it had sparked. Not Jacob. Someone else wearing Jacob's frame, like borrowed clothes. He knocked twice, firm but not aggressive. When Ruth opened the door, cold air rushed in along with the stranger's presence. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, removing his hat. "I'm Samuel, Jacob's brother." The family resemblance was undeniable. Same strong jaw, same deep-set eyes, same way of holding his shoulders square despite obvious exhaustion. But where Jacob's face had been open and warm, Samuel's held something harder, more calculated. "May I come in? I've ridden from Colorado. We need to talk about your situation." Ruth stepped back, instinct and propriety overriding caution. Samuel entered, bringing with him the smell of horse and distance. He moved through the small cabin like someone taking inventory, his eyes cataloging everything from the nearly empty woodpile to the meager supplies on the shelves. "Jacob wrote about you," Samuel said, settling into the chair by the fire without waiting for invitation. "About the marriage, the property, the child coming." Then his letters stopped. "He died in November," Ruth said, her voice steady through practice. "Mining accident." "I know. News travels slow, but it travels." Samuel's gaze fixed on her, assessing. "That's why I'm here. The Callahan family takes care of its own." Ruth adjusted the baby's weight, using the movement to avoid Samuel's eyes. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm managing." "Are you?" Samuel gestured at the cabin's sparse interior. "Widow with an infant, isolated by snow, living on land that half the territory wants to claim? How long before someone finds a legal reason to take it? How long before you're forced to sell at whatever price they're willing to offer?" The truth of his words stung, because Ruth had been thinking the same things through long winter nights. Her father's partners had already sent letters suggesting she reconsider their offers. The territorial judge had made it clear that her hold on the property was tenuous at best. "There's a tradition in our family," Samuel continued. "Goes back generations. When a brother dies leaving a widow, another brother steps forward. Marriage, protection, continuation of the family line. It's how we've survived, how we've built what we have." Ruth stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. "You want to marry me? I want to honor my brother's memory by protecting what he valued. You, his child, the land he died trying to secure." Samuel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I know it seems strange. I know you're grieving. But consider your alternatives." The baby began to fuss, and Ruth moved to the bedroom to nurse him, needing distance from Samuel's steady gaze and reasonable arguments. Through the thin wall, she could hear him moving around the main room, the sound of wood being added to the fire, water being pumped into the kettle. When she emerged, Samuel had made tea and set out the last of her bread. He'd rolled up his sleeves to work, and Ruth found herself noticing his hands. Strong hands, calloused from labor, no distinguishing marks or scars visible. "I'm not asking you to love me," Samuel said quietly. "I'm offering a practical arrangement that benefits both of us. You get protection and legitimacy. I get family and land to work. Jacob's son gets a father's name and inheritance rights." Ruth sat across from him, cradling the warm cup between her palms. Outside, snow continued falling, each flake another layer of isolation between her cabin and the rest of the world. "How long have you been in Colorado?" she asked. 3 years. Mining didn't work out the way I hoped. Time to try something different." "Did you and Jacob stay in contact?" "Letters when we could. You know how it is in the territories. Families scatter, but blood remains." The reasoning made sense. Everything Samuel said made sense. And Ruth was so tired of being afraid, so exhausted by the weight of decisions she felt unqualified to make. The wedding happened 3 weeks later, performed by the same preacher who'd buried Jacob. The settlement women clucked about indecent haste, but they also nodded with understanding. Survival demanded compromises that comfort could afford to judge. Samuel moved into the cabin, into Jacob's space, into the life Ruth had barely begun building. And if sometimes his way of standing at the window reminded her too much of Jacob, if occasionally his laugh carried echoes of a dead man's voice, Ruth told herself it was grief playing tricks, memory imposing familiar patterns on a stranger's face. She had no reason yet to suspect the truth. The barn burned on a spring night in 1883, 3 years after Samuel had become Ruth's second husband. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming, stumbling from bed to find Samuel's side empty and cold. By the time she reached the yard, flames were already consuming the structure, orange light turning the darkness into something biblical. Neighbors appeared from nearby homesteads, forming bucket lines from the creek, but everyone knew it was too late. The barn collapsed inward with a roar that scattered sparks across the night sky like malevolent stars. They found Samuel's body at dawn, or what they claimed was his body. The fire had been too hot, too complete. The coffin they buried 3 days later was sealed, just like Jacob's had been. Ruth stood at the second grave in 3 years, her 2-year-old daughter clinging to her skirts, her infant son in her arms. The preacher spoke about God's inscrutable will, about the trials that test the faithful. Ruth barely heard him. She was noticing other things instead. Samuel's work coat hung in the cabin, untouched by smoke or flame. His spare boots sat by the door, showing no signs of the ash that should have covered them if he'd been working in the barn. The barn itself had been nearly empty, most of the winter hay already used, no reason for anyone to be inside at midnight. And there was something else, something that nagged at the edge of Ruth's awareness, like a splinter under skin. In the chaos of the fire, she'd glimpsed a figure on horseback at the tree line, watching, just standing there, motionless against the darkness. When she'd looked again, he was gone. Thomas arrived 5 days after the funeral. He rode up to the cabin in late afternoon, dismounting with the weary grace of someone who'd traveled far. Ruth was in the garden, trying to coax early vegetables from soil that seemed determined to resist growth. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, and Ruth's hands froze in the dirt. The voice was wrong. Too similar to Samuel's voice, which had been too similar to Jacob's voice. The same cadence, the same slight roughness on certain vowels. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Thomas Callahan stood at her gate, hat in hand, face shadowed by the late sun. The family resemblance was there again, that same strong build, those same deep-set eyes. "I'm Thomas," he said, "the middle brother. I came as soon as I heard about Samuel." "How did you hear?" Ruth's voice came out sharper than intended. "The news can't have reached Wyoming yet." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I was already traveling this direction. Mining opportunities dried up. When I stopped in Helena, someone mentioned the fire." He moved closer, and Ruth found herself stepping back. "I know what you're thinking," Thomas said quietly. "Another brother, another marriage proposal. It must seem ghoulish. It seems convenient. Does it?" Thomas set his hat on the fence post. "Or does it seem like a family honoring its obligations? Samuel wrote to me about the property, about your father's holdings, about how valuable this land is becoming. He asked me to promise that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure you and the children were protected." Ruth's throat tightened. Samuel expected something to happen to him? "The territory is dangerous. Men die in accidents all the time. Samuel wanted to know his family would be cared for." Thomas pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket. "He wrote this 6 months ago. You can read it if you don't believe me." The letter was in Samuel's handwriting, or what Ruth had learned to recognize as Samuel's handwriting. It spoke of concerns about the barn's structural integrity, about increasing pressure from land speculators, about wanting to ensure Ruth's security. It asked Thomas to watch over the family if circumstances required it. Ruth read it twice, looking for signs of forgery, finding nothing but words that sounded exactly like things Samuel would say. "I don't understand," she said finally. "How many brothers are there?" "Were," Thomas corrected gently. "4 of us originally. Now just Daniel and me. And Daniel's in California, last we heard. Unlikely to come north." 4 brothers. 3 already dead or disappeared. Ruth thought about the pattern emerging like a shape in fog. Marriage, death, marriage, death. Each time leaving her more vulnerable, more dependent, more trapped by circumstance and isolation. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course." Thomas retrieved his hat. "I'll camp by the creek tonight. No pressure, Mrs. Callahan. But consider this. You're alone with 2 small children on valuable land. The territorial courts are getting more aggressive about what they call productive use. A woman alone might struggle to prove that case." He was right, and Ruth hated him for being right. She watched him lead his horse toward the creek, watched him move with Samuel's gait, Jacob's posture, something in his bearing that shouldn't have been familiar, but was. That night, Ruth went through Samuel's papers with new eyes. She found the marriage certificate, compared it to her marriage certificate with Jacob. The signatures were different, but something about the handwriting style felt too similar. Letters formed with the same basic structure, despite obvious attempts to disguise it. She found land documents that Samuel had prepared, transfer deeds that would activate upon his death. Everything legal, everything proper, everything designed to keep the property in Callahan hands, regardless of which Callahan was alive to claim it. The pattern wasn't random. It was engineered. Thomas married her 6 weeks later, and Ruth went to her 3rd wedding with eyes open and heart closed, no longer believing in love or family tradition. Only survival. Only the children who needed her to be strong enough to play whatever game these men were playing until she understood the rules. The discovery happened on an autumn afternoon in 1885, 2 years into her marriage to Thomas. Ruth was organizing household papers in preparation for winter, sorting through accumulated documents that had multiplied with each marriage and death. Thomas had been gone for 3 days, supposedly checking on mineral claims near the Canadian border. Ruth had learned not to ask too many questions about his absences. The answers always made sense on the surface, but underneath them lay a kind of logic she couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a dream that faded the moment you reached for it. She spread the papers across the kitchen table: marriage certificates, death records, property, transfers, birth registrations for her 3 children, the bureaucratic skeleton of her life, reduced to ink and official stamps. The first marriage certificate, hers and Jacob's, bore the date September 14th, 1879. The signature at the bottom read, Jacob T. Callahan, in confident, flowing script. The second certificate, hers and Samuel's, dated February 28th, 1880. The signature, Samuel J. Callahan, similar style, but different enough to be distinct individuals. The third certificate, hers and Thomas's, dated April 19th, 1883. Thomas R. Callahan. Ruth laid them side by side, studying the signatures with the attention she might give to a map of dangerous territory. The names were different, obviously, but something about the formation of certain letters caught her eye. The way each signature made the capital C in Callahan, the same slight flourish at the end. The angle of the lowercase a, identical across all 3. She pulled out other documents. A letter Jacob had written to the land office before his death, a claim form Samuel had filed for timber rights, a loan application Thomas had submitted to the Territorial Bank. The handwriting varied, but the underlying structure remained constant. Someone had tried to disguise their writing, but habits betrayed them. The way certain letters connected, the pressure of pen on paper, the rhythm of strokes. Ruth's hands began to shake. She found the birth certificates next. Her eldest son, registered as Jacob Callahan, Jr., born March 1880. Mother, Ruth Callahan. Father, Jacob T. Callahan, deceased. Her daughter, registered as Margaret Callahan, born June 1881. Mother, Ruth Callahan. Father, Samuel J. Callahan. Her younger son, registered as William Callahan, born August 1883. Mother, Ruth Callahan. Father, Thomas R. Callahan. But the dates didn't align with her memories. Margaret had been conceived in October 1880, when Samuel was supposedly her husband. But Ruth clearly remembered Jacob being alive in October. She'd been certain of it, because that was when they'd celebrated their 1-month anniversary. Except Jacob had died in November, hadn't he? 3 months after the wedding? Ruth pressed her palms against her temples, trying to force her memories into order. The timeline kept shifting like sand, events rearranging themselves depending on which direction she approached them from. A letter caught her attention, addressed simply to J. Callahan, with no first name specified. It had arrived 4 months after Jacob's funeral, and Ruth had assumed it was meant for Samuel, that the sender hadn't known about Jacob's death. She'd set it aside and forgotten about it. Now she opened it, unfolding paper that cracked with age. "Brother," it began, "your last report about the Whitfield holdings confirms what we suspected. The property is worth 3 times the territorial assessment. If you can secure it through marriage before the railroad announcement, we'll control the entire eastern approach. Stay the course. The plan is working better than expected." The letter was dated January 1880, 2 months after Jacob's supposed death, 1 month before Samuel's arrival. Ruth read it again, then again, each word landing like a physical blow. Brother, the plan, stay the course. She searched through the remaining papers with frantic energy, looking for more inconsistencies, more proof of what her mind was trying to tell her, but her heart refused to accept. A property deed signed by Jacob, dated December 1879, a month after his death. A bank statement for Samuel from March 1883, 2 months after the barn fire supposedly killed him. A surveyor's report commissioned by Thomas, dated October 1879. Before Ruth had even met Jacob. The documents contradicted each other, contradicted the timeline she'd been living, contradicted the narrative of tragic accidents and family obligation that had structured her entire adult life. Ruth gathered the papers and hid them beneath the floorboards in the bedroom, wrapping them in oilcloth to protect against moisture. She didn't know what they proved yet, didn't know how to arrange them into a coherent accusation, but she knew they mattered. That evening, Thomas returned from his trip. He brought her a length of blue fabric from Helena, smiling at her surprise. "Thought you could make something nice for yourself," he said. "You work too hard, Ruth. You deserve something beautiful." She thanked him, accepting the gift, watching him move through the cabin with the ease of ownership. He touched things the way Samuel had touched them, stored his coat where Jacob had stored his, sat in the chair by the fire with the same posture they'd all used. "Everything all right while I was gone?" he asked. "Fine," Ruth said. "Just the usual routines." Thomas studied her face for a long moment, and Ruth felt the weight of his scrutiny like hands around her throat. Then he smiled, that familiar Callahan smile, and nodded. "Good," he said. "That's good." But his eyes lingered on the kitchen table where she'd spread the papers hours before, and Ruth realized with cold certainty that he knew she'd been looking, that perhaps he'd expected her to look, that maybe the contradictions in the documents weren't accidents but messages, warnings, demonstrations of power. "We can make the records say anything," those contradictions whispered. "We control the narrative. What makes you think anyone would believe you?" Thomas drowned in Blackfoot River in March 1887, or so the story went. 2 witnesses claimed they'd seen him fishing when the current swept him away. The body was recovered 3 miles downstream, too damaged by rocks and water for proper viewing. Another sealed coffin, another grave beside his brother's. Ruth was 7 months pregnant with her 4th child when Daniel appeared. He didn't wait a respectful interval. Daniel Callahan rode up to the cabin 5 days after the funeral, as if he'd been waiting nearby, counting the hours until it was appropriate to make his entrance. "I'm the last one," he said by way of introduction. "Daniel, the youngest brother." Ruth stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame for support. Her swollen belly made sudden movements difficult, but her mind moved fast, cataloging everything about this man who claimed to be the final Callahan brother. Same height as Thomas, same build as Samuel, same bone structure as Jacob. The family resemblance had stopped being remarkable and started being impossible. "California didn't suit me," Daniel continued, as if Ruth had asked. "When I heard about Thomas, I knew it was time to come home, to help with the family." "There is no family," Ruth said flatly. "Just graves." Daniel's expression shifted into something meant to look like sympathy. "You have 3 children who need a father. You have property that needs a man's team for protection. You know how this works by now, Ruth. May I call you Ruth?" She didn't answer. She was too busy watching how he stood, weight shifted to his right leg, the way Jacob had stood, the way Samuel had stood, the way Thomas had stood. 4 different men, with the same unconscious posture, the same small mannerisms, the same way of tilting their head when listening. "I know you're tired of this," Daniel said, softer now. "I know it seems cruel, but the tradition exists for a reason. We take care of our own." "Your own," Ruth repeated. "Tell me about them. Tell me about Jacob and Samuel and Thomas as children. Tell me something only a brother would know." Daniel smiled, and in that smile, Ruth saw every deception of the past 8 years. Jacob was reckless, always jumping into things without thinking. Samuel was the careful one, always planning 3 steps ahead. Thomas was stubborn, wouldn't listen to advice even when he should have. The descriptions were perfect, too perfect, like someone describing characters in a story rather than real people who'd existed in complicated, contradictory ways. "And you?" Ruth asked. "What kind of brother were you?" "The one who survives," Daniel said. They married 6 weeks later. Ruth went through the ceremony like a woman sleepwalking, speaking vows she no longer believed, accepting a ring that felt like a shackle. Her 4th child was born in September, another son she named after her dead father because she refused to give him a Callahan name. But Ruth was no longer the confused widow, no longer the grieving woman desperate for protection. She was something harder now, something sharpened by years of accumulated suspicion. And she was watching Daniel the way a hunter watches prey, waiting for him to make the mistake that would confirm what she already knew. The mistake came on an October midnight, when Daniel stood at the window with lamplight catching, the crescent-shaped scar on his left hand, the same scar Ruth remembered on Samuel's hand 3 years earlier. The dead weren't dead. They'd been trading places, wearing different names like different coats, sharing her life like property they'd purchased through fraud, and deception. And now Ruth finally understood what she had to do. Ruth didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed beside Daniel, listening to his breathing, feeling the weight of 8 years pressing down on her chest like stones on a drowning victim. The scar had unlocked everything. Now she saw the pattern clearly, the way you suddenly see the hidden image in a puzzle once someone points it out. They weren't 4 brothers. They were probably 2 men, maybe 3 at most, rotating through identities, faking deaths, sharing her life in shifts while stealing her inheritance, piece by piece. How many times had Jacob really died? How many sealed coffins had held nothing but rocks and weighted clothing? How many grief-stricken funerals had been performances staged to reset the game board? Ruth thought about the hidden documents under the floorboards, the contradictory dates, the signatures that tried too hard to look different while revealing the same hand. She thought about her father's land holdings, now entirely under Callahan control, through a series of perfectly legal marriages and deaths. She thought about the territorial railroad expansion that everyone whispered about, the one that would make eastern Montana property worth fortunes. They'd been planning this since before she'd even met Jacob. The letter she'd found proved that. They'd targeted her specifically, a woman alone with valuable land, vulnerable enough to accept marriage to a stranger, isolated enough that no one would question a family tradition that sounded plausible on the surface. Daniel stirred beside her, and Ruth forced her breathing to remain steady, feigning sleep. His hand reached out in the darkness, finding her shoulder, and she felt the ghost of every touch she'd thought was love, every intimate moment that had been transaction, every word of affection that had been script. She'd loved a man who never existed. She'd borne children to strangers. What was real? The answer came with dawn clarity. Nothing was real, except what she could take with her when she ran. Ruth waited until Daniel left for town 2 days later, claiming he needed to file papers at the land office. She watched him ride away, then moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning in secret. She packed only essentials: warm clothes, dried food, her father's original land documents hidden in the floorboards, what little money she'd managed to save. The children stayed with a neighbor woman under the pretense that Ruth needed rest after childbirth. Ruth hated leaving them, but she couldn't risk taking 4 small children through mountain wilderness. She'd come back for them once she had proof, once she'd found help. She saddled the strongest horse and loaded the saddlebags with everything she'd need to survive. In her pocket, she carried the documents that proved her ownership, proved the fraud, proved that somewhere in the bureaucratic records lay evidence of multiple men using the same names to commit theft on a territorial scale. The sun was setting when Ruth finally mounted the horse. She looked back at the cabin one last time, at the graves lined up like accusations, at the life she'd thought she was building. Then she turned the horse toward the mountains and rode into the gathering darkness, not knowing that behind her, Daniel was already returning home early, already noticing the saddled horse missing, already understanding what Ruth had finally figured out. The hunt was about to begin. The first day, Ruth rode until her body screamed for rest. She pushed through mountain passes she barely remembered from childhood trips with her father, following game trails that wound between pine forests and rock faces. Behind her, she could hear them coming. Not one rider, multiple riders. That confirmed everything. The Callahan brothers riding together, no longer bothering with the pretense of separate lives and separate deaths. They were hunting her as a group because she'd finally seen through the performance. Ruth guided her horse through a narrow canyon as darkness fell, using the last light to navigate treacherous footing. She couldn't risk a fire, couldn't risk the smoke giving away her position. She ate dried meat and hard bread in the cold, wrapped in every piece of clothing she'd brought, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness and the more terrifying sounds of pursuit. On the second day, they got close enough that she could hear voices echoing off canyon walls. 2 distinct voices, maybe 3. Not 4. Never 4. Because there had never been 4 brothers, just a rotating cast of 2 or 3 men playing an elaborate con. She heard one of them call out, "Ruth, be reasonable. You'll die out here alone." The voice could have been Jacob's or Samuel's or Thomas's or Daniel's. They all blended together now, revealed as variations of the same performance. Ruth pressed deeper into the mountains, her horse exhausted, her own body pushed past the limits of recent childbirth. She knew these passes led toward Helena, eventually, toward civilization and witnesses and the possibility of justice. She just had to survive long enough to reach them. The third day nearly broke her. The horse went lame crossing a rocky stream, forcing Ruth to continue on foot. She could hear them behind her, their voices carrying through the thin mountain air, no longer pretending kindness. "The land is ours anyway," one voice shouted. "The marriages are legal, the deaths are recorded. You running just makes you look unstable." Another voice, closer. "Think about your children, Ruth. Who'll care for them when you're dead in these mountains?" The threat was implicit. They weren't trying to bring her back to keep up appearances. They were hunting her to silence her, to eliminate the one witness who could unravel their fraud. Ruth stumbled through pine forests, her feet bleeding in boots never meant for this kind of flight. She rationed the last of her food, knowing she'd need strength for the final push. In her saddlebag, the documents felt like lead weight, evidence that might never be seen if she didn't survive. As the third night fell, Ruth saw lights in the distance. Not pursuit lights, settlement lights. The convent she'd heard about, the Sisters of Mercy who maintained an outpost near the Helena Road. Sanctuary, witness, protection under religious law. She ran toward those lights like a woman pursued by devils, because that's exactly what she was. Ruth collapsed at the convent gate just after midnight, her fists beating against heavy wood until a small window opened and a face appeared behind iron bars. "Please," Ruth gasped. "Sanctuary. I need sanctuary." The sister who opened the gate caught Ruth before she hit the ground. Other nuns appeared with lamps and blankets, their quiet efficiency speaking to experience with desperate women arriving in the night. They carried Ruth inside, to a small room with a narrow bed, and one of them went to wake Mother Superior, Catherine. Catherine arrived wrapped in a heavy shawl, her face lined with age and wisdom that came from hearing confessions no priest would believe. She sat beside Ruth's bed and waited, not speaking, letting the exhausted woman gather strength enough to tell her story. "They're coming," Ruth said. "They'll be here by morning. You can't tell them I'm here. You can't." "Who's coming, child?" My husband. I don't know anymore." Ruth's voice cracked. "They're the same men, all of them. It's been the same men for 8 years." Catherine's expression didn't change. She'd heard impossible things before, had learned that the most fantastic stories often held terrible truth. "Start at the beginning," she said gently. "Tell me everything." So Ruth did. She poured out 8 years of marriage and widowhood, the impossible coincidences, the family resemblance that went beyond genetics, the scar that had appeared on 2 different men's hands. She showed Catherine the documents she'd carried, pointing out the contradictory dates, the 2 similar signatures, the evidence of fraud built on a foundation of staged deaths. Catherine examined each paper with careful attention, her face growing more grave. "This is a serious accusation," she said finally. "Fraud, identity theft, conspiracy. If you're right, these men have committed crimes that go beyond theft. They've corrupted official records, deceived the church, falsified deaths." "I know how it sounds," Ruth said. "I know it seems impossible. But the scar, Mother Catherine, the same scar on two different men who were supposed to be dead. How do you explain that?" "I don't," Catherine said quietly. "I believe you, Ruth. Believe something terrible has been done to you." The relief that flooded through Ruth was so intense it hurt. Someone believed her. After years of doubting her own perceptions, someone with authority and credibility believed her story. "What do I do?" Ruth asked. "How do I prove it? They control all the official records. They have witnesses to the deaths, staged funerals, sealed coffins. On paper, everything looks legitimate." Catherine stood, moving to her desk where she kept her private journal. "First, I document your testimony. Every detail, every piece of evidence. This journal is protected by church law. No civil authority can compel me to reveal its contents without extraordinary cause." She began writing, her pen moving steadily across the page, recording Ruth's account in careful detail. Ruth watched her write, feeling something like hope kindle in her chest. Here was someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought. Someone whose word carried weight in both church and territorial courts. "Tomorrow," Catherine said, still writing, "we'll contact the territorial marshal in Helena. These are federal crimes if they've been filing false death certificates and fraudulent land claims. The church will support your testimony. We'll protect you here until proper authorities can investigate." Ruth closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claiming her. "My children," she whispered. "I had to leave my children with them. What if they hurt them?" "Children are witnesses too," Catherine said. "They won't harm them. That would only add to their crimes and draw more attention. Your children are likely safer than you are right now." Ruth wanted to believe that. She had to believe that, because the alternative was unbearable. She slept fitfully that night, waking to every sound, expecting to hear the brothers' voices demanding entry. But the convent remained quiet, protected by walls and faith and the authority of women who'd seen too much evil to be shocked by one more version of it. Morning came with gray light and the smell of bread baking in the convent kitchen. Catherine brought Ruth breakfast and helped her wash and change into clean clothes borrowed from the convent stores. "They'll come today," Ruth said. "They'll ask about me." "Let them come," Catherine replied. "I'll tell them nothing. The seal of confession protects you." But when Catherine returned to Ruth's room after morning prayers, carrying fresh water and more food, she found the room empty. The bed was made, the borrowed clothes folded neatly on the chair. The window stood open to the mountain air. Ruth Callahan had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the documents Catherine had locked in her desk and the testimony written in her journal. Gone into the wilderness, into history, into silence. The brothers arrived 3 hours later, just as Ruth had predicted. Catherine met them at the gate. Two men who looked so similar they could have been twins, or the same man, seen twice. They asked about Ruth with voices that tried to sound concerned, but came out desperate. "I've seen no one," Catherine lied, invoking her authority as Mother Superior. "And even if I had, I'm bound by sacred confidence. You should go." The men left, but Catherine could see the calculation in their eyes. They knew Ruth had been there. They knew she'd told someone. But without proof, without Ruth herself, the story remained unprovable, a tale of conspiracy that sounded too fantastic to believe. Catherine returned to her room and wrote one final entry in her journal. Ruth Callahan came to us seeking sanctuary from men who stole her life through deception. I recorded her testimony. I offered her protection. But she chose disappearance over safety, silence over exposure. Perhaps she knew something I did not. Perhaps she understood that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, even in sanctuary. May God protect her, wherever she has gone. The men who called themselves Callahan brothers searched for Ruth for 6 weeks. They combed the mountain territories, questioned settlers, offered rewards for information. But Ruth had done what seemed impossible in 1887. She'd disappeared completely, leaving no trace, no trail, no forwarding address in the vast wilderness of Montana territory. Eventually, they stopped searching. Not because they'd given up, but because continuing would draw the kind of attention their scheme required avoiding. They returned to the property Ruth had inherited from her father, now legally theirs, through a series of marriages and deaths that looked legitimate on paper. The railroad came through 5 years later, just as they'd planned. The land values exploded. The Callahan holdings made whoever controlled them wealthy beyond territorial standards. But the brothers, if that's what they were, seemed to vanish into respectability, their names appearing less frequently in public records, their presence fading from local memory. Ruth's 4 children were quietly dispersed to distant relatives. The eldest went to an uncle in Wyoming. The daughter was sent to an aunt in Oregon. The 2 younger boys went to different families in Colorado and Nebraska. None of them were told the truth about their mother or the circumstances of their birth. They grew up with different last names, different stories, different lives, built on a foundation of lies they'd never understand. Mother Superior. Catherine kept her silence and her journal. She said in 1921, and the journal passed to the convent archives, filed away with decades of other documents recording the secret tragedies of women who'd sought sanctuary. It wasn't until 1934 that a researcher cataloging historical records discovered Catherine's journal. The researcher, a young woman named Eleanor Vance, working on her doctoral dissertation about women in frontier territories, found the account of Ruth Callahan buried among prayers and administrative notes. Vance spent 2 years trying to verify the story. She found the marriage certificates, the death records, the property transfers. Everything looked legitimate on the surface. But when she examined the signatures closely, when she cross-referenced dates and locations, she found the same inconsistencies Ruth had discovered. Documents that shouldn't exist. Dates that didn't align. Evidence of men using multiple identities across territorial records. She found something else, too. In the Montana Territorial Census of 1895, there was a brief notation about 4 children with the surname Callahan being raised by different families. Their mother listed as whereabouts unknown, presumed deceased. But there was no death certificate for Ruth Callahan. No grave, no record of her body ever being found. Vance published her findings in 1936, a scholarly article titled Identity Fraud and Land Theft in Frontier Montana, The Disappearance of Ruth Callahan. The article raised questions about how many other women might have been victims of similar scheme, how many fraudulent land claims existed in territorial records, how easy it had been for men to simply invent new identities and start over. But by then, everyone directly involved was dead. The property had changed hands multiple times. The men who'd called themselves Callahan brothers had long since vanished into history, their real names and ultimate fates unknown. What remained was Catherine's journal and Ruth's final recorded words, written in the Mother Superior's careful hand. I loved a man who never existed. I mothered children to strangers. What was real? The question echoes across nearly 150 years. What was real in Ruth's life? The love she felt, even if directed at a performance. The children she bore, even if their fathers were strangers wearing masks. The grief she experienced for men who never actually died. Or was the only real thing the moment she recognized the truth? The scar that revealed the deception, the decision to run rather than continue living a lie. Ruth Callahan disappeared into the Montana wilderness in November 1887. She was 28 years old, mother to 4 children, widow to 4 husbands, who might have been 2 men or 3 men playing an elaborate con game designed to steal her inheritance. Whether she survived, where she went, what name she lived under, nobody knows. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and Ruth kept hers. All that remains is Catherine's journal, Ruth's testimony, and the haunting question of how many other women's stories disappeared into frontier silence, swallowed by schemes too fantastic to believe, until someone finally bothered to look at the evidence. The scar that never moved, the brothers who never died, the woman who vanished like smoke. Some mysteries don't get solved, they just get remembered. And Ruth Callahan's story demands to be remembered, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to a woman who saw the truth, documented it, and chose disappearance over submission, who refused to keep living a lie even when the lie was safer than the truth. Somewhere in the vast Montana wilderness, perhaps there's an unmarked grave. Or perhaps there's a woman who lived the rest of her life under a different name, watching her children grow up from a distance, keeping silent to keep them safe. We'll never know, and maybe that's exactly what Ruth intended. If this story disturbed you, good. It should. Because the scariest part isn't that it happened once. It's wondering how many times it happened in territories where women had no voice, no protection, no way to prove that the impossible was true. If this story made you think, if it made you question how many other buried truths are waiting in historical archives, then do something about it. Hit that like button. It tells us you want more of these forgotten stories brought to light. Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to digging up the uncomfortable truths that history tried to bury. And most importantly, share this story. Ruth Callahan's voice was silenced, but ours doesn't have to be. Every share is another person who knows what happened, another witness to a crime that almost disappeared completely. Don't let these stories die in the darkness. Bring them into the light. That's how we honor the Ruth Callahans of history, by making sure they're never forgotten again.